how do you bear the suffering that is at the crux of life without becoming tempted and embittered? That's really, really difficult. Now, someone might point out, go ahead and be bitter, see where that gets you. And if you have any sense, and generally people have at least some, they know that being sick and bitter is worse than just being sick. And that being, right, it's worse, but it's very hard temptation to avoid. Sometimes you want to be bitter just out of spite in some sense, because things are so terrible, all you've got left is your willingness to shake your fist, and say, well, really? Is this like this many poisonous snakes? Really? That's like, maybe I could have learned with just 1 or 2, not 100. And so, but we're all stuck with that. And I think we're stuck with it at every level of our life in some sense, is how do we maintain a high order moral orientation in spite of suffering and malevolence?
Yeah, when I was a young seminarian, one of the things that I struggled with, I worked in a neonatal intensive care. In this summer, I baptized over 20 babies, and all the babies died. And it was I was a seminarian, I was supposed to have all the answers, right? And they'd come to me and they'd say, tell me real quick, why did this happen? This God, why did he allow this to happen? And I came to the place, a couple things. One is that I didn't have to defend God. Like in my own mind, in my own heart, there was something very freeing in that. I don't know why. I mean, what kind of explanation? Let me explain to you why this happened. Oh, well, thank you so much, brother. Yeah, that makes sense. I wish somebody would have told me that, right? But what I did, what I would continually come to is that, and this is a mystery of the faith, that Jesus is present in the midst of the suffering. And I tell a story. Actually, the first book I wrote was on freedom, and I spent a lot of time in that Exodus text, because that's the invitation to look at Pharaoh and be freed in that. But that when we're children and we fall down and we scrape our knee, our mom comes and she kisses us and she pats us on the head and said, it's going to be okay. And it is. I mean, really, what has she done? She's kissed me on the head and she's patted me, she said, it's going to be okay. But we grow up and we don't think that's enough anymore. But my experience tells me is that when Christ can do that for me, in the midst of my brokenness, in the midst of my suffering, and in the midst of my pain, and remind me that I'm loved, right? I remember sitting in the chapel, it was a Thursday evening as a seminarian, trying to figure all this out, and hearing the Lord breaking in the midst of that and say, Dave, I love you. And I said, well, I appreciate that, but that's not the issue. Let me explain the issue. What am I supposed to tell these people? And he reminds me that I'm loved, and it's enough. It's enough. And it's the Christian mystery of suffering, that it ought not be something that we try to escape, but it's actually an invitation that we continually find Jesus, because I suggest that when we find God in the presence of the suffering, we can find him anywhere. It's easy to find him in a sunset or in a baptism. Take a brand new baby, pour oil all over him and grease him up, and it smells the chrism. It's wonderful. It's easy to find him in that. How about cancer?
Yeah,
and divorce and infertility? That when we can find, and that it's the mystery of our faith, that God enters the messiness rather than just fixing it from the outside. He enters this and takes this upon himself and transforms it. When we find him there, I suggest we find him anywhere. My experience is that our faith becomes more real, it becomes more authentic, it becomes more present when we can find him in the midst of that.
Yeah, well, that what would I say about that? Well, I guess one of the things I would say about that is that perhaps it looks like, we have something difficult to do, as it turns out. We might think, and why wouldn't we, that we would rather that things were easy and pain-free, and fair enough. But that isn't what our life is like. It's extremely difficult. It's difficult to maintain an ethical orientation in the midst of malevolence and suffering. And that means, in some sense, and I suppose this is part and parcel of the Christian story, that we have some divine calling. It's something like that. It's like, and that divine calling is to establish what's good in the midst of what isn't.